In history, there have been moments when catastrophic events wiped out any meaningful progress for the survival of humankind. From Beirut to Bangkok, from Addis Ababa to Santiago, and from Geneva to New York. The COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on all 17 Sustainable Development Goals is imperiling our shared vision to end poverty, rescue the planet, and build a peaceful world. The Arab States region is not on track to achieve the SDGs. While a few targets have already been met at the regional level, others are only achievable with structural change.
Before COVID-19, the Arab region had already seen the only increase in extreme poverty globally. The pandemic has pushed an additional 14 million people into poverty, and conflict has left 55 million in need of humanitarian assistance. The region has allocated about $100 billion, but lacks an additional 70 billion in liquidity to mitigate COVID-19 impacts. Arab countries have adopted the Arab multidimensional poverty framework, but they still need to adopt inclusive social protection systems that are financially sustainable, systems that are catalysts for upward mobility. The Arab region is one of the most unequal in the world. 37 billionaires own as much as bottom half of its adult population. Creating national solidarity funds that connect the wealthiest with the poorest is an innovative policy measure to alleviate poverty and reduce inequality. Shared responsibility and societal solidarity is what the region needs.
Asia and the Pacific is not on track to meet most of the Sustainable Development Goals. Progress is slow or stagnant, and in some cases, regressing. With the COVID-19 pandemic, faster progress is needed for 80% or more of the measured targets for poverty and inequality, gender equality, and climate action.
Asia and the Pacific is a development success story. 80% of the extreme poor were lifted out of poverty by 2015. And yet, Asia and the Pacific is still characterized by increasing inequality and high levels of informal labor. 60% of the population is not covered by social protection. 40% have no access to health care. This ingrained inequality has been exacerbated by the pandemic. The unprecedented responses by our countries have opened up the possibility for a different future. Many have raised the level of investment in social protection and healthcare and targeted the segments of society that had been forgotten. Inclusive social protection policies and bringing the furthest behind to the forefront. This is our way forward.
To achieve the targets of the 2030 Agenda, the UNECE region needs to accelerate progress. While it is on track with eradicating extreme poverty, the pandemic has exacerbated persistent inequalities. Progress has been good with some targets relevant to gender equality, though at the current rate of progress, only 40% of measured targets would be achieved.
Despite some important advances, inequalities remain a major concern for the region. The COVID-19 crisis means redoubling efforts to ensure no one is left behind. 140 million people in the pan-European region still lack access to clean water. I call on all governments to join our protocol on water and health to uphold this basic human right, which is a first line of defense against pandemic. 150 million people in the region cannot afford decent housing. With the UN regional system, UNECE supports countries to close those gaps.
The integrated spirit of the 2030 Agenda is at risk in Latin America and the Caribbean region. While a few SDG targets have already been met at the regional level, others will only be achievable with strong policy interventions. Available data shows progress in achieving some SDG targets, but sustained efforts are required for others.
Inequality defines Latin America and the Caribbean. Wealth, income, social protection, education, knowledge, and skills are in the hands of the few. Progress made on eradicating poverty have been set back more than a decade in a matter of months. ECLAC estimates a GDP contraction of minus 9.1%, with a rise of poverty up to 231 million and 96 million in extreme poverty. Governments have provided emergency basic income to the poor and tax exemptions and grace periods to micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. ECLAC proposes to extend these measures for 9 months. We also propose a basic digital basket comprising a laptop, a smartphone, a tablet, and low-cost connectivity for households without internet. We need a political, fiscal, compact to ensure universal social protection.
Africa is not on track to meet most of the Sustainable Development Goals. Even before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, Africa was not on track to meet any of the targets of SDG 1 to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. Of particular concern are the efforts towards achieving SDG 5 on gender equality. More than half of the measured climate targets would not be met unless progress accelerates.
In the last decade, Africa has made progress in reducing poverty. However, 300 million Africans still live below the poverty line. With COVID, 400 million vulnerable Africans may fall into poverty, and that will see us at about 700 million Africans falling into poverty before the end of the crisis. Africa is in its first recession in 25 years. Governments will need to support the process of getting people out of poverty. We will need to do two things. The first, social protection programs. Today on the continent, we spend about $6 billion on social protection programs. We will also need to do job creating programs to ensure that particularly the youth who have fallen into poverty and are more resilient can find jobs for themselves and work their way out of poverty.
While women across Arab countries are making great strides in society and the economy, the region also has the highest level of female unemployment globally and one of the lowest levels of political participation.
Violence against women is on the rise and costs the region an estimated $245 billion. Arab countries should focus more on empowering women economically, continue to do away with social discrimination policies, and create opportunities for them. Embracing technology and creating enabling platforms that support, fund, and scale up businesses powered by women is key. Incentive measures are also needed to link women's small businesses to the region's top businesses through integrated value chains. Investing in women is critical to achieve stable, just, and prosperous Arab societies.
The pandemic risks undoing years of progress in gender equality. Millions of women's jobs in the informal sector have disappeared. Unpaid care work has increased exponentially. Thousands of small and medium-sized enterprises have closed, many of which are run by women.
Rising to the challenge of gender inequality makes the commitment of the Beijing Declaration ever more important. We are witnessing this momentum of change in the Asia-Pacific, lifting their barriers to political participation and leadership, ensuring women's economic empowerment and integration into formal economy, developing gender-responsive and inclusive social protection, and ending violence against women and girls. These are central to our commitments to achieving gender equality in Asia and the Pacific.
For gender equality, the UNECE region has made important strides towards targets on maternal, sexual, and reproductive health. But the COVID-19 crisis has disproportionately affected women both at work, where a quarter of women are in precarious jobs, and at home. Violence against women and girls has surged dramatically. Decades of progress on the empowerment of women are at risk. I encourage all stakeholders to join UNECE's efforts to promote the use of gender-specific standards. I call on governments to support women-owned smaller businesses to drive the recovery we need for the SDGs.
The crisis precipitated by the pandemic is having a disproportionate impact on women, who bear the brunt of an excessive burden of unpaid work, increased poverty and job insecurity, limited access to public services, and insufficient financing for gender equality policies.
Women are worse off than men in terms of discrimination, political exclusion, and lack of economic autonomy. Violence against women and girls is the tragedy of inequality exacerbated in these pandemics. The crisis is affecting women more severely as they account for more than 60% of informal labor, and confinement is placing additional pressure as primary caregivers, paid and unpaid. Women are on the front line of the response to the health crisis and are more exposed. They account for 72% of those employed in the health sector. Public care systems are being considered by the region based on examples of Uruguay and Costa Rica to open labor options for women. The region has performed well in equal education for women, which in fact reaches tertiary education more broadly than men. However, there is a need to improve their economic autonomy through access to high-quality jobs, equal pay, and financial inclusion.
90% of Africa's women work in the informal sector and 70% work on cross-border trading or earn their incomes from cross-border trading. To ensure that these women can continue to be prosperous, one is to give them an identity. Informal economies do not generate prosperity. So finding ways of formalizing their businesses and ensuring that they become fully contributing members of society is going to help achieve gender equality. On cross-border trading, the main and most important element, particularly for women businesses, is to ensure, one, that they have access to financing, but secondly, that we can harmonize processes to ensure that when women trade across borders, Africa has 76 borders, that they meet and confront the same kinds of regulatory environments. With the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement and the prospect of harmonizing cross-border trading, we hope that we can move further into gender equality on the continent.
Economic growth in Asia and the Pacific has been coupled with increasing vulnerabilities to climate-induced disasters and rising environmental degradation.
When it comes to climate and environment, our region needs acceleration across the board. It means moving towards decarbonization by 2050, a rapid end to fossil fuel subsidies and new investment in coal, tackling air pollution, transforming to green and smart infrastructure and transport, investing in new technology and big data to prepare and respond better to disasters, conserving and protecting our oceans. Part of this transformation have started to take shape. Countries are working on their national roadmap for SDG 7, increasing the share of renewable energy in their energy mix, switching to the use of clean cooking fuels, strengthening regional cooperation for sustainable oceans. We now look to the SDG Moment to set course for the future, one that is inclusive, gender equal, and green.
The Arab region registers the highest temperatures on record, reaching 55 degrees, with 5 more expected by the end of this century. Water and land resources are already strained. Nearly 87 million people lack access to drinking water. The region has already committed to increasing the share of renewable energy in its energy mix and needs to adopt integrated water management policies. However, financing remains a challenge. Exploring new financing means, such as debt for climate swap, is an option. Now is the time to integrate climate action into national planning. People cannot wait, and the planet cannot wait. Accelerating SDG implementation is our way forward.
With its high material footprint, the UNECE region must make its resource use more sustainable. Recovery packages must mobilize investments for the future, fully aligned with the green transformation needed to address climate change.
The region generates some 40% of GDP, but only 1/3 of global CO2 emissions. This shows the region has made some progress towards decarbonizing its economy. The region must further reduce energy use. Buildings' energy needs produce 40% of CO2 emissions. Improving building energy efficiency can deliver massive climate gains and create millions of jobs. Countries must reduce their dependence on fossil fuels and accelerate investment in renewables and low-carbon technologies. As we enter the last 10 years of Agenda 2030, I invite all governments to work with us to make the circular economy a reality.
Our region contributes only with 8.3% of global emissions, yet is highly vulnerable to climate change. Climate action should be the driving force to recover and build back better with job-intensive and carbon-free investments. Our region pledged a collective target of 70% renewable energy by 2030. Investment in renewable energy sources jumped 65% with records in Argentina and Mexico. In Brazil, expansion of wind power mobilized 8.2 million and created 250,000 jobs. Costa Rica, Chile, and Uruguay committed to become carbon neutral in 2050. ECLAC is advocating for debt reduction for resilience in the Caribbean and the creation of a Caribbean resilience for adaptation. In Latin America and the Caribbean, building back better means reshaping development with equality and sustainability.
Over 3 to 5% of Africa's GDP is lost because of climate change. There are 2 areas where Africa can contribute to the reduction of CO2 emissions. The first is agriculture. The second is energy. In agriculture, two policies that we can put in place. The first is reduce extensive agriculture, do more intensive agriculture, but increase productivity, which will increase yields. Add an additional $100 billion to the economy and create 40 million jobs. In energy, Africa today is clearly energy deficient. Over half of our population does not have access to energy. More importantly, industry does not have access to make it competitive and trade globally. Therefore, we will need to produce more energy. Africa has 22,000 megawatts in its national determined contributions. We hope to find financing to do that. That is why Africa is asking for $100 billion to help it get out of the COVID crisis, and special drawing rights to help ensure that we can continue to finance the private sector to ensure that Africa grows back better from the crisis.
Coming out from this pandemic cleaner, greener, and more resilient will require immense political will. The 2030 Agenda must be our blueprint for our collective action.